I am Ahmed Shahabuddin, and today on the stream we mourn the loss of Shireen Abu Akleh, an Al Jazeera journalist who was killed by Israeli forces, and also ask what the international community can actually do to hold Israel accountable. Shireen Abu Akleh, an iconic Palestinian-American journalist, was covering an Israeli army raid on the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank when she was shot in the head. She was killed instantly, despite wearing a vest and helmet that clearly identified her as press. Her legacy is being remembered around the world by many.
There is truly no words to describe the pain and grief we feel as we mourn the loss of the brave Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. I think we're all shocked. We're still processing the news. We lost a brave voice. We lost a brave journalist who was always there on the ground covering Israeli continuous crimes. She was murdered in cold blood exactly for doing so, for telling the truth, even though she was visibly and clearly marked as press for the Israeli snipers who shot her and targeted her in her head. I'm honestly at loss, but all I can say, they wanted to silence Shireen, but we will hold her memory and her legacy.
Joining us today to discuss this obscene crime, its implications, and how it's being covered by international media, in Ramallah, Mariam Barghouti, a Palestinian researcher and writer, and in Amman, Jordan, Omar Shakir. He's the Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch. Welcome to the stream. I want to start, Mariam, by taking a moment and pointing to a tweet that you've been sharing with the world, saying you recall Shireen Nasri's voice echoing in the house as she covered the brutality of a military invasion, tanks and bombs when you were a child, that she was the only journo that covered an arrest of yours by soldiers, and then you also remember her as a mentor. Obviously, Mariam, Shireen was, a woman, she was a journalist, she was a human, she was a Christian, she was many things. I want to ask you, how are you remembering her, and what was your initial reaction to this tragic news?
I think it's the same current reaction where we're all reacting and trying to grieve, but at the same time, still in disbelief. Did Shireen Abu Akleh's voice really end? Our entire childhood echo of her voice, especially on Al Jazeera, especially at a time where nobody covered the Intifada and the raids on Palestinian villages and just the violence, the brute violence. Her, Walid Omari, we refer to them as the original Jazeera staff. And you'd think she's safe because she's a journalist, she's a senior journalist, and she's an American citizen, and she's a veteran. And then today we all wake up to the news about Shireen, not Shireen giving the news. And I really think that strikes a chord.
Yeah, it's clear to so many who knew her and also who respected her. Omar, you heard Mariam recalling what Shireen meant beyond even a journalist for so many. What was your reaction? How are you feeling?
The first thing I thought about is the fact that Shireen has been doing this for 2 decades, and then she woke up at 6 or 5:30 this morning and decided that she had to be herself on the front lines to tell the story of this violent Israeli army incursion into Jenin. And it's exactly the kind of story the world needs to hear because, in recent days and weeks, we've seen Palestinian after Palestinian, brutally gunned down. And Shireen had the conviction to wake up, to go there early in the morning. Her last email she sent to colleagues that's been shared on social media speaks to this resolve, this determination to tell the truth. And it's such a powerful testament to her legacy and her work. I mean, as Mariam put it so poignantly, not only for Palestinians that live, in Palestine, but also for Palestinians in refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan. She was the voice for so many. She told the stories at a time when so few were willing to do so bravely and courageously. And it's difficult to put into words, what that means and how and how much we're worse off without her telling those stories.
And on a day like today, there's been so much being said politically by Israel, by the military, by Israel's leaders. We've seen, for example, on Twitter, the Embassy of Israel saying they had a video that shows that it was Palestinian gunfire that actually killed Shireen. Of course, there's also this follow-up tweet saying there was no claim that the gunfire killed Shireen Abu Akleh. So backtracking, and it seems as though we've seen in just 30 minutes ago, the U.S. State Department spokesperson saying they trust that Israel has the wherewithal to investigate this and to hold those people responsible accountable. It's exhausting to talk about this without seeing any accountability for year after year, decade after decade. Omar, do you have any faith that this will be prosecuted?
No one can have faith that the Israeli government will investigate its own abuses because we have decades of its practice of whitewashing abuses. It's the same script. I mean, again, Israel has been systematically, routinely using excessive force, gunning down journalists. Let's not forget the Gaza March of Return when we lost Yasser Mortaja and other Palestinian journalists. And the UN Commission of Inquiry wrote a report at the time where they wrote that Israeli forces shot at, quote, journalists performing their job knowing who they are. The Israeli government follows the exact same script. They misdirect, they lie. They hope this will just get buried away, and the international community all too often is complicit in the same formulation. So it's critical, that we challenge, we push, we speak out. We don't let the same script happen again.
Right. And, when we talk about not letting the same script happen again, I wonder, Maryam, I'm sure you've seen, for example, Ayman Muhyiddin, who used to work for Al Jazeera, now works for NBC News, tweeting and commenting about this. He wrote on Twitter, the Israeli military and the Israeli government are incapable of carrying out an impartial and fair investigation in the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. It is imperative that a thorough and independent international-led investigation is conducted. When you see these calls from people who we know for a long time are aware of kind of why there is no accountability, do you have any hope that things can change? What are the steps that need to be taken? It's almost demoralizing to keep asking that question without any change.
It is, and I think the issue is that we're asking the wrong questions. I think we need to come to a point where we need to ask ourselves, why are we so uncomfortable with the idea of a liberated Palestine from the river to the sea? And once we come to a conclusion to that, we can either see our inherent racism, or we can start mobilizing forward. Because that's the crux of the issue, right? The entire narrative has revolved around Israeli concerns, Israeli lives, and the idea of Palestinian lives, the idea of Shireen Abu Akleh shaking the world, makes us uncomfortable. And that's where I think we really need to head towards for change, right? The UN has legitimized Israel. The UN is basically a monarchy of 6 states with veto power that's just recently being challenged. And Israel thrives off of its colonialism of Palestinians. We are literally lab rats for psychosocial warfare, demographic engineering, aerospace technology, surveillance technology, and really that's what makes it thrive. It's not just Shireen. It's really not just Shireen. And I think Shireen is just a spark in anything to really allow us to see how deep this is.
Yeah, and just for those watching at home, if you're joining us on YouTube, we invite you to give your thoughts, your questions, your comments on Shireen's legacy and the larger implications of her death, and we will share those views throughout the show. Omar, I want to ask you, this tweet from Ambassador Tom Nides, he's saying, very sad to learn the death of American Palestinian journalist. He goes on to use the word encourage, referring to an investigation that he wants to happen. Ayman Muhyiddin posted this. I'm referring to it again because, he's saying that the word encourage is too weak. Terminology aside, we've seen some sort of strange new realities and normalization of the disproportionate power dynamic. Even Abdullah Fayyad, a Boston Globe writer, if you look at this tweet, saying, what a strange, revealing thing for an Israeli military spokesman to say as a preemptive defense of killing a Palestinian journalist. He's referring, of course, to the part where a military spokesperson today said they're armed with cameras, if you'll permit me to say so. That referring to, justifying the fact that even if she was targeted, that somehow there's a justification for this. When you see how, Western leaders continue to say one thing, but then allow Israel to act with impunity, to not properly investigate, to not hold the people accountable, given your work, where do you think the conversation needs to go?
I think Maryam is absolutely right that the issue with Shireen's killing is not simply a case of bad apples or an abuse that's committed. We're talking about a structural violence. We're talking about an underlying daily reality where everyday Palestinians face either the cold institutional violence of a system dedicated to the domination of one people over another, or the hot violence of bloodshed of Palestinians gunned down, which happens on a routine daily basis. And I think too long the international community tries to focus on even when they want to. Let's say the example where there is absolutely no argument otherwise. It's these bland calls about investigations. We saw 4 months ago when a Palestinian American man, Omar Assad, a similar script 4 months ago, outrage calls for investigation, and quickly the story fades into the background. And meanwhile, the violence against Palestinians in repression continues on a daily basis. So I think we need to recognize reality for what it is. We need to listen to Palestinian voices like those of Maryam and those on the ground.
Yeah.
And I think we need to fundamentally shift the paradigm, and we need to take action ultimately to end complicity with these serious crimes and to hold the perpetrators accountable.
And when we talk about shifting the paradigm, obviously it's imperative that we do that in the mainstream media, online, in every corner that this discussion's being had. I want to share with you something Sharif Mansour from the Committee to Protect Journalists had to say about this. Take a listen.
We at the Committee to Protect Journalists are calling for an immediate and transparent investigation by both Israeli and Palestinian authorities for the horrific killing of Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh. We know that those investigations have in the past resulted in nothing. And this is why we also think today is a reminder for the UN inquiry into the actions of both parties against journalists, including the killing of at least 18 journalists to our count since 1992.
Omar, there have been countless headlines. If you look at this one from the New York Times, Shireen Abu Akleh, trailblazing Palestinian journalist, dies at 51. It's become strange, to even discuss sort of the way in which Israel's erased from being an aggressor, from being accountable for murdering children, for bombing hospitals, schools. We cover this on this network. It's seldom as covered on other networks. I wonder what you think will actually bring about that shift in paradigm that you say is so badly needed in the mainstream media. Do you see any signs of hope?
Look, I do think there's been a shift, and I think that shift is the product of Palestinian organizing and advocacy, over many, many years. And I think that's resulting in increasing consciousness in the international community. But it's not enough. It's not going far enough. We still see a repetition of the same sorts of, misframings, misanalysis, misinformation consistently thrown around. So I think it's important that, as Maryam put it, that we continue to amplify and Palestinian voices. We need to listen to those voices and perspectives, even when it's hard and when it challenges some of our foundational, thinking. So I do think there's been a shift, but obviously that shift wasn't enough to stop the bullet that killed Shireen. It wasn't strong enough to hold Israel accountable, for its systematic daily violence, repression, and apartheid against Palestinians. So we need to keep doing more of it, and I hope the days ahead will see more of that.
And, Maryam, when you see comments, whether from Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who called for a moment of silence, today in Washington, D.C., or even from Andre Carson of Indiana saying, I join countless others in mourning the death of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed by Israel's military while on assignment. The U.S. must hold the Israeli government accountable for this and all other acts of unjust violence it commits. When you see more and more people speaking out, whether in a tweet or what have you, do you feel there is a shift, as we heard Omar outline?
This is where I'm going to have to differentiate. I feel the shift, but unfortunately for Shireen and unfortunately for all of us here and trying to move forward, it means nothing if it's not followed by action. I'm really happy we're reaching this awareness, but it really needs to move forward now. Accountability means stop arming Israel. Invest these American tax dollars in building a healthcare system in the U.S. Invest them in ending racism, so you don't elect a president that wants to build a wall to ban immigrants and puts children in cages. Maybe kind of shift it there. So we really need to move forward in that. As wonderful as it is, this diplomatic language, it really means nothing on the ground.
Right, and you know, speaking of a lot of people on YouTube, I should say, are saying this is not the first time Israel killed Palestinian journalists. This is Adventure Khan saying international organizations still keep silent. The Western media is also silent. And, you know, that's part of why we want to talk about this and talk about Shireen as a human. You say it's not enough, Maryam, and I know that you're not alone in feeling that way. If you look at this tweet from Dalia Hadouqa, she's a friend of Shireen's. She says, "My sweet girl, I can't believe this. What justice is there in this world? There's none as long as you live under Israel's military rule. They will say they will investigate. What does it matter? She's gone." Not to get too existential, obviously a powerful rhetorical question there, Omar, but does it matter? Let's go with that. Does it matter if there will be an independent investigation? Does it matter if Western leaders will start to pressure Israel?
It matters if it can actually change the reality on the ground. I think Maryam's absolutely right to point to the fact that, well, there has been some shift in the framework and the paradigm, which is critical and important, until it actually results in changing the reality on the ground for Palestinians. It's not enough. But our goal here is to, prevent, to do what we can to end complicity in Israel's crimes, prevent, down the road more of this from happening. And that's only going to come with real action. I think Maryam identified some of the things that need to stop, and I think it starts with forms of complicity, whether it be, business operations, arms sales, all these things that further entrench the daily systematic violations that take place. I think we too often, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, exceptionalize, what's necessary. But the bottom line is we need to hold, Israel to the same standards of other countries that commit crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other abuses. And the disconnect between the rhetoric, the analysis, the framework that we see applied to the Ukraine, to China's treatment of the Uyghurs, and to the way that Palestinians are treated by Israel, that needs to end.
And, just for people who are not aware of the context, I want to share this with our audience. Also put this to you, Maryam. Between 2020 and 2022, in just 2 years, 6 Palestinian journalists were killed in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. That's according to the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate. More than half have been killed in the last 20 years of the 86 Palestinian journalists that have been killed since the 1967 war. The syndicate also documents, more importantly, Maryam, between 500 and 700 attacks a year by Israel on journalists. And as someone who's reported on the ground for both Al Jazeera and for Vice, in both cases attacked and seemingly targeted, but certainly Al Jazeera has a certain cachet, for better or worse, and a certain targeting. What can you share with us about your experience there on the ground and what you think can actually pressure Israel to be more mindful that journalists must be protected?
Well, for starters, all mainstream media need to stop hiring senior correspondents as Israelis while not hiring Palestinian correspondents under the pretext that we can't be objective. Israel needs to be held accountable for every crime it held against every journalist, but more importantly, for the reason why they killed them, and that is that they are Palestinian. It is not a disrespect for press. It is a disrespect and a disvalue of human life that is Palestinian. When you see correspondents from CNN, from the New York Times, or from BBC, and they're international, they automatically do have more protection. But what happened today with Shireen shows you how microaggressions will escalate. So eventually Israel will be even more emboldened, and even the international senior correspondents won't be safe. Just like Givara Budeiri last year in Sheikh Jarrah was being attacked brutally by Israeli border police, begging and yelling, saying, "Don't touch me, I'm press." And we didn't pay enough attention, and now we're getting killed. So we also really need to pay attention to that. As media news agency, there is a duty. You have that duty to uphold.
When you talk about duties, there are also human rights organizations, including B'Tselem, on the ground that has been debunking a lot of the propaganda that Israel has been publishing today, including the suggestion that it was Palestinian gunfire that killed Shireen. Take a look at this comment that was sent to us from the executive director of B'Tselem.
As always, Israel tried initially to shift the blame. The Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Minister of Defense, and the IDF spokesperson all propagated the narrative based on a short video clip suggesting that it was Palestinian gunfire that killed the journalist. However, a B'Tselem field researcher, today, this morning in Jenin, easily refuted this false narrative. It was very clear to demonstrate that there is no way that the footage that the Israeli army was propagating is footage of gunfire that could have hit the journalists.
It seems, Omar, even with the work of B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and many other human rights organizations, especially the Palestinian-led ones, that we are still not having the paradigm shift and the accountability, more importantly. Are you encouraged at all by this sort of work and these partnerships?
I think there's a unique moment where there is a clear shared sense of the reality on the ground that spans from Palestinian and Palestinian human rights groups have been doing this, of course, for decades. Israeli international groups. There's a consensus across the human rights movement that Israeli authorities are committing crimes against humanity, apartheid and persecution against millions of Palestinians. There's a sense that there is a single government policy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea that's aimed at preserving the domination of one people at the expense of another. And there's increasing efforts across civil society organizations, to push for real consequences to be imposed on the Israeli government. And I think that's a really unique moment that we're in. Again, it's not yet translated into shifts in the policies of governments around the world. And that's a failure of the human rights movement. And I think we need to acknowledge and accept that reality that while we may have a shared assessment, that the international community came too late to that. Palestinians have been describing their lived reality for years and decades, and not enough of us listened. So it's important it's happening, but for it to actually matter, we need to actually translate that paradigm shift into changes on the ground, and we're frankly not there yet, and we're not close.
And when we look at certain leaders like President Biden, when he said just last week at the White House Correspondents Association dinner, we honor journalists killed, missing, imprisoned, detained, and tortured, covering war, exposing corruption, and holding leaders accountable. I wonder, there's so much rhetoric around how much we protect and honor journalists, and then very little action when they're a certain type of journalist or when geopolitics goes against that truth. So thank you so much for being with us, both Omar and Mariam. We're going to have to end the conversation there.
لن أنسى أبداً حجم الدمار ولا الشعور بأن الموت كان أحياناً على مسافة قريبة. لم نكن نرى بيوتنا. كنا نحمل الكاميرات ونتنقل عبر الحواجز العسكرية والطرق الوعرة. كنا نبيت في مستشفيات أو عند أناس لم نعرفهم. ورغم الخطر كنا نصر على مواصلة العمل. كان ذلك خلال عام 2002 حين تعرضت الضفة الغربية لاجتياح لم تعهده منذ احتلال عام 67. في اللحظات الصعبة تغلبت على الخوف. فقد اخترت الصحافة كي أكون قريبة من الإنسان. ليس سهلا ربما أن أغير الواقع، لكنني على الأقل كنت قادرة على إيصال ذلك الصوت إلى العالم. أنا شيرين أبو عقلة.